color correction is a very important part of the post-production process. During this process, you should follow a workflow to achieve best results, starting by correcting individual shots for proper contrast, color balance, and saturation. You then go through and establish shot-to-shot consistency, making sure that each of the shots within a scene looks like they belong together. And finally, you have the option of stylizing your footage to add a particular look or style. We'll touch on the first part of this workflow in the next several videos, which should give you some solid skills in the art of color correction. And at the end of this chapter, we'll also touch on the second phase. And to learn more about the rest of the process, you can check out many other color correction courses available in our library. Now, in order to go through the color correction process, you need two main things to do it right. You need to look and analyze with your eyes, and you need a series of video scopes to measure various values. So in this video, we'll cover the first step, analyzing the footage with our eyes. All right, so in order to get an idea of the process, I'm going to take a look at several shots from our Ovens of Cappoquin project. First, we have a shot of Esther in the kitchen. Then we have an outside shot of Cappoquin right outside the bakery. And then here, we have a shot of a baker by the oven. These shots need a lot of help, but it's honestly not uncommon for you to work with images like this, and you should absolutely take the time to color correct your shots across the board. All right, so let's begin with this shot of Esther. We want to ask ourselves a series of questions. First, what part of the image is supposed to be white, and what is supposed to be black? Well, there's a lot of white in this shot. Her apron, the paper on the back wall. Her shirt is a little bit of an off-white, I think. Probably the brightest, whitest part of the image is her apron, though. As far as black, I think some of the shadows behind her here should be black or almost black. Otherwise, we don't have a lot of other shadow value that is really going to reach true black. Next, how are the brightness and contrast? Well, this image is just dim and muddy. Nothing is too dark and nothing is too light. So we need to increase our contrast range in order to make it pop. We need those brighter highlights and darker shadows. Doing this will make everything much more vibrant. Next, how are the colors, and is there a color cast? Well, there's a slight cool color cast. The flesh tones are muddy, so we'll look at brightening and warming those up to give Esther more vitality. Finally, how is the saturation level? Again, the image is pretty muddy and flat, so we'll need to bump up the saturation across the board. All right. So let's take a look at our next shot here and ask ourselves the same questions. What part of the image is supposed to be white? Well, this is interesting. There are certainly white parts of this image, the lines on the street, the window panes on the buildings. But in this case, it's definitely relative, because this part of the sky is by far the whitest, brightest part of the image. In fact, it's so blown out that even when we color correct, we won't be able to bring down these values. We've lost the detail, and we aren't going to get that back. That said, if this is the brightest, whitest part of the image, then relatively everything else in the image will register a lot less bright than that. In terms of the black parts of the image, the entire thing is much too dark. There's a lot of shadow, but ultimately some of the shadow detail on the buildings back here and the trees, as well as perhaps her pants, should register as black. Next, how are the brightness and contrast? Well, besides the blown-out sky, the image is really dark, so we need to increase the brightness a lot, but we also need to prevent more of the sky from getting too blown out. So our goal will be to maintain the detail in the rest of the sky while elevating the brightness of our lower midtones. And once we elevate these tonal values, the contrast range will even out. What I mean is, right now we've got super bright and super dark values. So once we elevate those lower midtones, then we'll have a much more evenly spread out set of tonal values. Next, how are the colors, and is there a color cast? Well, frankly, it's hard to see a lot of the colors in this image since it's so dark. Things might look a little bit cool, but color cast isn't really the problem here. We've got a darkness problem. Finally, how is the saturation level? Same answer as before. The image is so dark that it's hard to even see color. Still, I think the image is probably undersaturated, so once we correct the contrast, we'll probably bump up the saturation quite a bit to give this image more life. All right, great. I think we have a pretty good idea of where we're going with this shot. Now, let's take this shot here of the baker by the oven. And this time, instead of being so methodical about it, I'm just going to look at it and give a brief summary of what I see. All right, so the baker is in front of the fire, so it's providing a very warm glow to the entire image. When we correct it, we'll definitely want to keep some of this warmth. We won't totally want to remove the effects of the firelight, But overall, things are just too brassy, so we'll need to back off on that a bit. Now, the highlights on his shirt should be the whitest part of the image, and the wall behind him will probably come out quite a few shades darker than that. We do have a very bright spot over here by the oven, and while it's not white, it's still very bright. And the darkest part of this image is this part of the wall back here, as well as some shadows in the oven and some shadows over here in the fabric. Overall, the image is too dark, especially in the lower midtones, which makes his face fall in shadow and not show a lot of detail. So we'll work on brightening up the darkest parts of the image, which will even out the contrast range. That should bring some detail back to his face. And in general, I think the image is maybe a bit too saturated. So once we make those adjustments, we may back off on our saturation levels just a bit. All right? So again, even before we begin measuring our video signal, we already have a jumpstart on what we need to do. This analysis part of the process will get easier and quicker. And soon, you'll be able to perform the analysis in a matter of seconds before you dive into correction.